everybody, and a very warm welcome to this Thinking About webinar, which is co-hosted by Dulwich College and the schools of the Southwark Schools Learning Partnership. So a real warm welcome from Dr. Spence and Mrs. May, the directors of that partnership. It's a great pleasure to welcome Lord Hain of Meath, who'll give this webinar. As you all know, Lord Hain's had a very distinguished career, a very colourful career, and I think one could say a very courageous career in his consistent commitment to anti-racism. And that's one of the things he'll be talking about, his experience of that as it pertains to sport. He's currently a very active member of the House of Lords and a former cabinet minister. I think this is a really appropriate moment to capture for very obvious reasons. It's the conclusion of Black History Month. And I should also say that Lord Hain has recently published his first novel, The Rhino Conspiracy, and is about to co-publish a book, Pitch Battles. Both of those books, if I can give a plug to them, are available signed copies from Dulwich Books. Justin, Lord Hain's going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then Justin and Will lead the questions, do ask questions, and then we'll give our vote of thanks. But Lord Hain, you're most welcome. Thanks for so generously giving of your time this evening.
Thank you very much, and delighted to be with you this evening. I have had an unusual life, as you indicated, Dr. Pike. I was brought up in South Africa. My childhood was in the late 1950s and early 1960s. When I was a boy, one of my earliest memories was being woken up as a 10-year-old to be told that my parents had been put in prison. They were young, white, anti-apartheid activists, very brave and unusual because none of my relatives were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle led by Nelson Mandela. None of my friends' parents were involved. My parents were extremely unusual in the city of Pretoria, the capital of the country where we lived. And they'd been put in jail for 14 days, for 2 weeks, just taken away from myself and my younger brother and sisters, whom I had to wake up and tell that they had been put in jail. And then things got worse, and my mother was issued with a banning order in 1963 when I was 13. A banning order meant that you couldn't take part in political activity. It meant that she couldn't come to speak with our teachers at schools about our progress at school. She used to come and watch us play cricket or football or rugby, and my sisters run in school races, and she wasn't able to do that after she was banned. One of the many other clauses in a banning order was you could not talk to another banned person. So when they banned my dad a year later, this presented the government with a problem they'd never faced before, which is a husband and wife being banned and therefore unable to talk to each other under the law. So they had to give them special permission to talk to each other, for which, as you can imagine, they were very grateful. But what was important about my upbringing in sport, which is the subject this evening, is that when I was a boy, I was not able to play cricket or football or rugby with or against anybody who didn't have a white skin. The law of the land was that schools were rigidly segregated under apartheid. So I went to a whites-only school. There were schools for black kids and Indian kids and colored kids of mixed race, the four racial groups in South Africa: white, black, colored, and Indian, as they were officially designated. I couldn't, in other words, schools was rigidly segregated, housing was segregated. I lived in a white suburb. Black citizens lived in black areas. Asian citizens lived in Asian-only areas, and colored citizens lived in colored-only areas. and schools and housing and jobs were segregated as well. And even if we went to watch our local football team, I was mad keen on sport as a kid, and I still am. I support Chelsea, by the way, just to let you know that. There'll be some of you watching who are not Chelsea fans, I imagine. I can't understand that, but I'm sure it's the case. So I was a mad keen sports fan as a teenager and as a boy before that. And we used to go and watch our local football team in Pretoria called Arcadia, and Arcadia Shepherds they were called, and I played for their youth team. And when we would walk with black friends of my parents to the match, and then we'd have to divide, and they went to one end of the ground and we went to the whites only end of the ground, and it was a white team that we were both cheering. And a lot of black spectators were the noisiest, the most vocal in support of Arcadia. Black South Africans, although the rugby teams just won the World Cup last year, actually are football mad first and foremost, as was the case in the early 60s in Pretoria. So we'd have to divide up to be at either ends of the ground. And then in 1962, when I was 12, so you can guess my age now, a proclamation came in that did not allow black spectators into whites to watch white teams. So not only previously they'd been segregated off on one end of the ground, now they couldn't watch at all. Some were so mad keen on Arcadia that they shinned up trees surrounding the ground to watch the matches and cheer on the team from there. White neighbors were so angry about this that they called the police, who pulled these young men mostly down from the trees using dogs. And one of my most graphic memories of a kid around about age 12, 13 was seeing this happening and seeing them pulled, just ordinary sports fans pulled out of the trees, their legs bleeding from the teeth of the dogs. So apartheid was a vicious system and it affected sport as it affected every other form of life. And my mother and father, who were joining Nelson Mandela in the struggle, as I described, they were jailed for 2 weeks, never charged because they couldn't find enough evidence on them. They were then issued with banning orders. And eventually, in 1965, they stopped my dad working as an architect. They didn't allow him, any local architectural firm, to employ him. He designed hospital laboratories. So he worked for himself, and then the special branch found out, the security police found out that he was working for them, but as self-employed, these architectural firms, and they banned that as well. So effectively, we were deprived from earning a living, and we applied for and were granted British citizenship, and were able to travel to Britain in April 1966, when I was age 16, and start a new life in exile in Britain. As we came out from Cape Town on the southern peninsula of Africa, southernmost part of Africa, and also the southernmost part of South Africa, we passed Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was then 3 years into his prison sentence in a cold, bleak cell. And I remember looking out from the ocean liner, the cheapest way to travel, much, much cheaper than airline travel, which would be now cheaper than ocean liner travel. I remember looking out over the railings and seeing Robben Island for the first time and thinking, trying to imagine what life was like for him. So I went to school, then transferred schools and went to school in London, and it was very different, a lot rainier. The sunshine of South Africa is very distinctive, and an outdoor life as a young boy was ideal, but London was very different. I went to school in Battersea, and a few years later, when I was at university, I found myself leading a campaign to stop all white South African sports tours. Being a sports fanatic and getting involved in the anti-apartheid movement as an 18-year-old, 17, 18-year-old, and got really involved in radical politics, protesting against the American war in Vietnam and other things, including the illegal rebellion by the white racist minority regime in the old Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. So I was very involved and got increasingly involved. And when South Africa did not allow a cricketer called Basil d'Oliveira, who was born and brought up in South Africa, but because he wasn't white, although he was an excellent cricketer and could easily have made the South African team, because he wasn't white, he wasn't allowed to play for his own country, and therefore had to travel to Britain to play in Britain, and was so successful that he was actually selected for England. And by this time in the mid-1960s, he was a regular England cricket player. But England chose him to tour South Africa in our winter of 1968-69, when I was 18, 19. And they banned the tour. They stopped the tour because he was allowed in. Nevertheless, they wouldn't allow him in to play for England in his own country because it would have contravened all their laws and embarrassed them that here was a South African cricketer who was so top class that he ended up playing for England but couldn't play for his own country. Despite that, the English cricket authorities nevertheless invited the white South Africans to tour England in 1970. And I was so outraged about this that I initiated a campaign to stop that tour. And we used novel tactics which had never been used in sport before, which was to run on the pitch of rugby games, cricket games, sit down, stop the matches. In the case of the cricket tour, that was due to take place in May 1970, but before that, in the British winter of 1969-70, a Springbok, whites-only Springbok team was due to tour. It played 25 matches, and I led a campaign as the leader of this campaign. I hadn't expected to be, was thrust into the leadership of the campaign and became a national political figure on television all the time and in the newspapers at the age of 19. Because I'd come up with the idea of physically disrupting the matches through non-violent direct action, the kind of action which you'd have learnt about that the suffragettes took protesting for votes for women in Britain, that the early trade unionists did the same kind of thing. The Chartists in the 19th century protested for the vote for working men and took direct action themselves as well. Non-violent direct action, running on a rugby pitch to stop the whites-only Springbok team from playing, because it was a racist team, it was an apartheid team. And if you fast forward 50 years to a year ago, almost to the day, the Springboks won the Rugby World Cup in Japan with a black Springbok captain, Siya Kolisi, and half a dozen black players, top class, world-class players, some of whom scored tries, for those of you who follow rugby. They won the World Cup. They're the top champions of the world. At the time I was leading protests against the whites-only Springboks, the chief of South African rugby, a man called Dani Craven, said, "Over my dead body, will there ever be a black Springbok?" Well, he had died in the meantime, but then there was a black Springbok captain lifting the World Cup. And it was partly because of that campaign, because we so disrupted the tour by running on the pitch, throwing smoke bombs. I say bombs, I mean they were pellets really that had smoke all over the field. We had dye that we threw onto the damp turf at Twickenham, and the slogan was "Paint them black and send them back," because they were white players, and the dye was basically if there was a scrum or something and they rolled on the turf, then it darkened their skin. And the Springbok tour was heavily disrupted in these different ways. And then our real target was to stop the 1970 cricket tour, a whites-only sports tour again. And we had made all sorts of preparations for this. We discovered that there was a disused underground tunnel of the Bakerloo line that had an air vent that came right up under and into Lord's cricket ground. And so we planned to infiltrate thousands of demonstrators in through that disused tunnel and come up through the air vent into the ground and wreck the game, basically. Others had model airplanes. One couple of lads had model airplanes. They were model airplane fans, who had an aunt who lived in a block of flats overlooking Lord's cricket ground, and they planned to buzz the ground during play if these matches went ahead. Others had mirrors, had bought tickets, as we all did for these matches, bought tickets, and we're going to use mirrors for those of you who follow cricket closely, you'll know that if you get the sun glinting in your eye, you can't see the ball. So there were all sorts of things. Anyway, the pressure got so great that eventually the government requested that cricket tour to be stopped. And white South Africa never toured, never played cricket again in Britain, and never again was there a whites-only rugby Springbok tour either, or any other kind of tour coming here representing the country. It was that direct action which was a novel tactic. For years, the anti-apartheid movement had held up placards outside Twickenham Rugby Stadium or Lord's Cricket Ground or wherever the white South Africans were playing sport, protesting that it was racism and apartheid, the representation of apartheid on the sports field. But actually, the rugby authorities and the South Africans didn't mind that. But when we actually physically stopped the matches, it disrupted them and made life very, very difficult, to the point where the cricket tour had to be called off, or to be frank, we would have wrecked it. And I was very relieved that it was called off in May 1970, just before it was due to start. We'd got to the point where actually we had got the capability to stop those matches. The same thing happened in Australia the following year, a carbon copy of our campaign, and similar things happened in New Zealand. And South Africa, after that Stop the 70 Tour campaign, was propelled into sporting isolation, expelled from the Olympics, and so on. And just to end on this note, before I open it up for questions, Nelson Mandela told me when I met him first, my parents knew him from Pretoria in the late 1950s and early 1960s, but I didn't meet him until he came out of prison. And he came to the House of Commons. I was an MP by then in 1991, and I met him for the first time. And he told me that there was a news blackout on Robben Island in the winter of 1969-70, our winter, during the Springbok tour and the demonstrations, and that he'd learned from his furious white warders about the demonstrations through that news blackout, and how inspiring it was, and what a morale boost it was to him and his comrades on Northern Ireland. On the island of Robben Island, and he said it was fantastic for them to learn about it. The warders, rugby fanatics to a man, all white, who were very violent towards the prisoners, were absolutely furious and blamed Nelson Mandela, not realizing they were communicating something precious to him and his fellow prisoners, all black prisoners, namely that there was a strong anti-apartheid movement that able to wreck the Springbok tour. So he said those sports protests were absolutely critical at a time when the leadership was all on Robben Island, where resistance inside the country of the kind that my mother and father had taken part in, and many, many other activists, that had all been closed down, been put in prison, tortured, exiled, intimidated, and it was a very bad time for the anti-apartheid struggle. So that sport played a crucial part in the anti-apartheid struggle, which ultimately, of course, was victorious. Nelson Mandela was freed from prison, negotiated a transition to a democratic country, and became president of his country in 1994. And now sport is open to all, regardless of color. My old school in Pretoria has black school students of your sort of age playing rugby, playing cricket in a way that was never possible in my day. So the anti-apartheid struggle in the end was victorious, and sport played a crucial part in it. Thanks very much, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Lord Hain, absolutely fantastic insight into those times. We do have a first question which has come through, and the question is, when did you realize what the government in South Africa was very wrong, or did you always know, and how did it make you feel?
Well, I was unusual as a white schoolboy, as were my younger brother and sisters, in that my parents were amongst a very tiny kind of 0.01% of white South Africans who took part in the anti-apartheid struggle. So we had black activists, supporters of Nelson Mandela's and colleagues of his coming to our house in a way that had never happened before. I remember one came to our house when I was a kid, and he had the front door open to him, and he said, "I've never walked through the front door of a white man's house before," because the role of black citizens of South Africa was to act as servants for white families, and typically it would always be through the back door of white homes. So I became aware from a very young age 9, 10, about apartheid in a way that my school friends were not, and my white school friends and my white school relatives were not either. It became part of, in a sense, life. And then what happened to us, one of my earliest memories, another early memory, I mentioned the one about my parents being jailed, was finding police officers, security officers, searching our bedroom. My brother and I shared a bedroom in the early hours of the morning. So, you know, life was very unusual for a white kid, as I was then. And so I learnt about apartheid from a very early age.
Well, I'll just jump on that one. We've got one from Nat. He says, do you think that sport is poorer for being embroiled in politics? And I think that's something that for me, I don't know if you know, sorry, Lord Hain, that I played hockey for South Africa for about 10, 12 years. You know, one of my big things is that I just wanted to play sport and enjoy it and do as well as I could. And sometimes behind the scene politics, there were people making decisions which affected us, and you know, we weren't obviously privy to those, and obviously things that affected us, and I suppose effectively almost ended up with me ending up in this country as well, and earning a living here.
Well, I mean, first of all, what was unique about South Africa is that politics infected every part of its sport. So it would have been the same for you, I guess, but I don't know what era you were living in South Africa. But so I described to you from the very beginning of my talk how I went to a whites-only school, could only play whites-only sport because of the law of apartheid, because of politics affecting sport in every way. Basil D'Oliveira couldn't play for his country. There could never have been a black Springbok captain to lift the World Cup because that was politics in sport. So what the South Africans did, although the charge against us was introducing politics into sport, was they brought their racist politics, the most racist system the world has ever known, into their very sports system. Now, then there's a wider question, which maybe you were touching on, Mr. King, about your own experience subsequently, about, you know, maybe quota systems and so on in the new South Africa. I personally do not think sport can be divorced from politics any more than life can be divorced from politics. and I'm not saying that simply because I'm a politician, the quality of the education you're all individually getting is a function of politics. If you go to a state school, the quality of that teaching, the pay the teachers are getting, the equipment that you have to support yourself in that school are all a function of politics. And there have been big reductions in spending on schools, on state schools in the last 10 years in particular. That's politics. That's a function of the policies of the particular government that we have. So I you know, just like I don't think life can be divorced from politics, because it affects everything from whether your dustbin's cleared to the quality of your education, what sort of university, if you want to go to university or are able to, you're able to go to, what sort of job you might get, and so on. So in that sense, sport is part of life, and therefore sport is affected by politics. And we've seen recently, haven't we, with the Black Lives Matter protests following the gruesome murder on live video of a black man in America, George Floyd, by a white police officer who literally just squeezed the life out of his throat by stopping him breathing. And the protests that were unleashed from that affected sport too. Black sports stars like Lewis Hamilton, I happen to be a Formula One fan, started speaking out about racism in motor racing, or racism in football, or racism in cricket in Britain. So I don't think it's possible to isolate politics from sport, but in South Africa's case, it was a unique intrusion of politics into its sport through racism.
So our next question is from Aristo, who's asking, how do you feel about direct action nowadays, such as climate change and Black Lives Matter protests? Do you think the protest is impactful nowadays?
Yes, I mean, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm very much in support of Extinction Rebellion protests. You know, there was one point where they occupied Parliament Square and further up Whitehall, and I went to join them, which was frowned upon by fellow parliamentarians. I'm not saying I agree with everything that they do. They tried to kind of disrupt it. I think it was an overground journey on the London transport system, which I didn't think was sensible, because public transport is the least intrusive, the least harmful to climate change. It's cars in terms of transport, and diesels in particular, which are most damaging. But yes, I do, and I think Black Lives Matter protests made sure that the issue was really in front of attention, because most of us in our lives, and that's probably true for all of your parents and relatives and uncles and aunts and grandparents, of those of you taking part in this event, you know, we don't think about politics all the time. We're getting on with our lives, but I think it was important those protests took place. Extinction Rebellion against climate change, which is the biggest threat to the future of humankind, and for your generation, it's the biggest threat to the continuation of life on this planet, and it'll affect you much more than it's affected my generation, even though my generation's mainly responsible for it. So yeah, I do think non-violent direct action, provided it's non-violent, I think it's a way of protesting and making sure that you get change. You know, I just say one other thing, Will, and by the way, congratulations for all your achievements in hockey and England participation and so on. That's fantastic. But you know, change isn't just brought about by changing the government. Change happens from outside. The suffragettes didn't get the vote because finally Parliament agreed to it magnanimously, virtually male-only Parliament. Women got the vote because the suffragettes chained themselves to railings outside the House of Commons and took non-violent direct action.
Thanks for that answer. And our next question is from Suzanne, who's asking, what do you think of current sports people's anti-racism protests by taking the knee?
Well, thanks for asking that, Suzanne. I'm very supportive and sympathetic to it. I think it's good And this would never have happened in recent years, let alone decades ago in British sport, for officialdom from the top, from the Football Association, the Premier League and the Football League, and cricketers and motor racing on, I don't know if any of you watch motor racing as I do, Lewis Hamilton winning the race last Sunday as he tends to do. There was a taking the knee at the start, as there is of every football game. I think it's a symbol, yes. It's got to be followed by action, but it's an important way of sports people. Comes back to Mr. King's opening question. Sports people saying we're not immune from politics. We're not in our own little oasis, or desert island that is separated from life outside.
Our next question from Antonia is, do you think sporting boycotts were a main reason for the collapse of apartheid, or do you think economic sanctions and internal tension had a greater effect?
I think they all played their part, Antonia. Sanctions were very difficult to achieve. We tried in the anti-apartheid movement to impose economic sanctions and arms sanctions because Britain was selling arms to South Africa as well as trading with apartheid for most of the entire time that apartheid existed. A Labour government came in and stopped the arms sales, but by and large, these went on. And in the end, it's economics that matters. And we tried to stop economic links and did succeed in getting Barclays Bank to disinvest from South Africa. It was a British-based bank that had branches all over South Africa, and what we did was we took non-violent direct action by stopping them recruiting new students to Barclays Bank accounts on university campuses, and so eventually, under pressure, they withdrew. But it's a combination of all of those things. There were then loan sanctions, financial sanctions put on by the United States of America Congress against the wishes of President Reagan, who was in power at that time in the late 1980s, and that had a big effect. The internal resistance, which by the 1980s was great, had sort of been sparked off by school students actually in 1976. The resistance having been closed down when Mandela and his fellow leaders were locked up on Robben Island in 1964. The resistance was effectively closed down until 1976, when school students in the black township of Soweto outside Johannesburg protested, and there was a huge protest, and the police gunned them down, killed them, injured them with bullets, and that ignited a huge rebellion, which then spread in the 1980s, and that's probably what's behind your question, Antonia. So that by the time the government came to talk to Nelson Mandela in prison in the late 1980s, South Africa was becoming ungovernable. But the sports protests were very important in depriving white South Africans of something that they craved. They were sports mad. Most white South African boys like me, as I was, and men were sports fanatics. And apartheid was reviled apparently around the world and sort of criticized, but actually they were feted at Twickenham and Lord's Cricket Ground and in the Olympics and so on. So hitting that was very important, as all white South Africans who followed this will tell you. It was a combination of things.
It's an interesting thing you say there, with regards to, South Africans being sport mad. And obviously, I was a youngster during the apartheid era. I finished school in '93, and during the '80s, my ambition and all I wanted to do was to play hockey for Great Britain at the Olympics. And again, that, say forced through South Africa being...
for Great Britain or for South Africa?
No, for Great Britain, because I had a British passport.
Okay, yeah. But so you were saying it hit you as a young white South African boy playing hockey because you had to your only option for you was to play in Britain.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose I was quite naive to the fact of obviously the greater sort of workings and what was going on. But you know, for me, my world was sport. And
Yeah.
as I say, all I wanted to do was play international sport and go to an Olympic Games.
Well, you're probably underlining my point, because and one of the reasons, and your parents' generation still will remember that, Mr. King, but I was called public enemy number one in South Africa. I was absolutely hated, and so much that the security police sent me a letter bomb in June 1972, which had the capacity, the Metropolitan Police's bomb squad told us, to blow me up, my family, where I still lived at home, and our house in southwest London. So, you know, there were lots of attacks on me, because white South Africans felt really badly hit for exactly the reason you're saying. And that gives me an opportunity also to say, you know, people take for granted now that Nelson Mandela came out of prison and became president of his country, and that apartheid no longer exists. But it was a very hard battle. It was we were a minority in Britain, you know, across the world. It was a really, really hard battle to win.
Moving on, the next question is from Mr. Phil Greenaway, our Director of Sport, and the question is, what is the state of race relations in South Africa in present day?
Well, Phil, there's still a residual legacy of apartheid. I mean, apartheid existed for 50 years, and before that, there was the legacy of colonialism, British colonialism. I mean, racism was entrenched when European settlers first came to South Africa in 1652. Dutch settlers first arrived at Cape Town, and then Europeans came increasingly over during the 18th and 19th centuries. And the British, when gold and diamonds were discovered in the 19th century, Britain basically took over the country and pushed the other settlers sort of out of the picture. Afrikaners, they became known as, half the white population roughly speak Afrikaans, which is a language derived from Dutch and Flemish, historically from European settlers, and then the other half are English-speaking white South Africans, like I was. So racism was established under British colonialism, and apartheid was a sort of Nazi-like institutionalized refinement and extreme version of it. So you've had racism in South African society for generations, going back hundreds of years, and you can't eradicate that overnight. So race relations, I mean, South Africa today, if I visit it, and pre-COVID, I've been increasingly teaching there and so on, and going on holiday, and enjoying going back there enormously. It's a lovely place to visit. If you ever get the chance, do so. It's expensive to fly there, but once you're there, the pound takes you a long way. It is as day and night compared with what it was when I left South Africa in 1966 under apartheid. You've got a best constitution in the world, but there's still racism. There's still racial tension, and there's an element now of a sort of sect of black South Africans who are trying to push white farmers off their land and murdering quite a few of them and so on. So that's a problem. And there's also massive inequality still, because apartheid effectively reduced black South Africans to a semi-slave-like status. Massive unemployment, low skills, terrible housing conditions, no electricity or running water for millions and millions of people. And in the period since 1994, which is not that long ago, to 26 years ago, there's been big changes for the better, but the legacy, you can't change these things overnight. So there's still racism, there's still inequality of a massive scale, but it's a lot better than it was.
Okay, so our next question is from Nico Constantino, who's asking, what motivated you to be part of the small minority of those who thought against the apartheid when so many people around you weren't as motivated to put a stop to the issues?
Admiring my parents' stand and what had happened to us. I mean, I didn't want to leave the country of my birth. I had a lovely, lovely boyhood there. And you know, we didn't want to leave. We were forced to leave for the reasons I explained. And you know, wanting to change things for the better became my inspiration. There's a fantastic quote which I would invite you all to look up, where Nelson Mandela talks about making a difference, which inspired me. And he said, you know, isn't the point of life is not simply to exist; it is to make a difference for the better. And we can all make our own difference in our own ways. You know, helping others, doing, getting skills to help change society for the better. Being a good teacher, teaching is probably the most important job in the world because you're giving life chances to young people. We can all make a difference, but it was being brought up. It was in my DNA in a way.
Okay, so our next question is from James, who said, good evening, Lord Hain. Your work within the field of sport activism is deeply impressive and has clearly achieved a vast amount. The issue, though, of racial inequality is of course not yet resolved. In what ways do you think sports now can continue to drive forward and promote equality?
That was from James, was it? Yeah.
Yes, from James.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter protests have focused, and a lot of leading sports people like Raheem Sterling, for example, the Liverpool star and England star, have said, well, there's not enough. It's good to have taking the knee at the start of football matches, but what about the representation amongst senior management of clubs, both coaches and also in the administration of the game, where there are very, very few black faces. So there's an issue of equality there, James, that needs to be addressed in all sports. And cricket's talked about having a minimum proportion of almost like a quota system on its administrative bodies. I mean, that's, I think, a good thing. It's a transitional thing. I don't think in the end quotas are, and South Africa's been through this, are the answer, but they are a way of kick-starting change. So there needs to be a lot of greater diversity, and not just, by the way, racial diversity, but also gender diversity, because women's sport has become much more, women have demanded much more equality in sport. I don't know if any of you followed her, but there's a fantastic women football player in America called Megan Rapinoe, who's the captain of the US football team, and they won the Women's Football Cup the other year, and she won the sort of star women's player in global football. But she's been very, very vocal about this, and I admire her a lot. So there's a long way to go to get greater equality.
Next question, and very similar, I suppose, leading on from the last question from Will, different Will, not Will Gurney. It's after 30 years of ANC rule in South Africa helped create equality of opportunity in sport. Clearly, we see many more black South African sportsmen than during apartheid. But how much more progress needs to be made before there's real equality of opportunity?
Massively more. If you take the Rugby World Cup winning team led by Siya Kolisi, who was brought up in absolute poverty outside the city of Port Elizabeth in a township there. I mean, he wasn't even getting a full meal a day. And he was recognized as a rugby player of real potential, as were all of those Black Springboks in that winning team almost a year ago. And he was spotted and selected and given a scholarship to an elite, mostly white, had traditionally been a whites only school called Gray's College in Port Elizabeth. Maybe Worth, Dulwich College and or other schools linking up with those schools. Actually, it'd be very interesting for you to do so. So they were given scholarships from poverty, and that's how they got for rugby playing schools, and that's how they got into that channel to reveal their ability and to really compete equally. Now that's only available for a select few. So it'll take a long time to get equality of opportunity in South Africa, because it's starting from such a bad base of massive inequality. There's still a lot of inequality in Britain, and that's reflected in all sorts of ways. But South Africa has got this huge legacy of apartheid that I described earlier, and that affects sport as well. If you can't even get a full meal a day, and how are you? And and he was born after apartheid ended. Then how are you going to Siya Kolisi was? How are you going to actually get genuine equality of opportunity? So there's a long way to go. In terms of South Africa, since over the last 30 years, tremendous progress has been made. But the big negative about it, and I've spoken out publicly under parliamentary privilege in the House of Lords and taken other action, is the corruption that there has been under the former President Zuma. And once you get corruption, who was president for 10 years, betraying all Nelson Mandela's values, and Mandela himself was, ruled by absolute integrity and morality. But Zuma, one of his successors, who was also on Robben Island, just basically looted the country and has left the economy in a bad state, as well as appointing people to jobs that they were not competent to do. So a combination of corruption and cronyism has badly disabled South Africa, on top of the apartheid legacy, and left it, in a much more difficult place.
As you say, just on that, there's that basic needs philosophy, isn't there? Of first and foremost, you want shelter, food, running water. So people who do get spotted get that opportunity to be, looked after within the private schools and given opportunities. But as I said, most of the country is still living in poverty, and that is a major problem, isn't it? Where
it is a problem, and it's a problem in our own society. I mean, you just look at the effect of COVID. I guess amongst the 80 odd students who are taking part in this webinar, some of you are probably living in conditions which are not as nice as others, and maybe don't have the same sort of access to Wi-Fi and the internet and to laptops, and able to work in your own room and things like this, that my grandchildren, for example, have fortunately got. So there's a lot of inequality in Britain, but yes, South Africa's got this additional legacy, which is of racism and apartheid and colonialism, and huge inequality, which was deliberately organized by the state to overcome. And you can't overcome that in one generation, let alone in a few years.
Okay, so our next question is from Bev, who has asked, did you have any idea how famous you were in South Africa? I was in high school at that time and certainly was told you were the #1 enemy of the country. Fortunately, most of my generation could see the injustices of the system.
Yeah, I was aware of that. And in fact, I was also a bit hated in Britain too at the time. There was a quote, the editor of the Sunday Express said this about me at the time in 1971. He said, "It would be a mercy for humanity if this unpleasant little creep were to fall into a sewage tank up to his ankles head first." So a lot of rugby and cricket and sports fans in Britain didn't like me either. But when you make change, you often upset people and disturb people. So Bev, yes, that is the case. If that was the last question, can I thank you all for having me on to talk to you. As we mentioned at the beginning, I've got a new book coming out at the end of the month called Pitch Battles: Sport, Racism and Resistance, which tells the story of sports apartheid. And I've also written a new thriller, which is out already, on corruption and rhino poaching, called The Rhino Conspiracy. But I just conclude by wishing you all the best as students. And I know adults always tell you to do this, but do work as hard as you can, because getting skills is the passport to life. It's the passport to a decent life, you know, and that requires hard work. Nothing is actually worthwhile unless it involves hard work, in my experience. But, you know, doing well at school is absolutely vital to that. So good luck in that. And thanks to all your teachers who are helping you achieve that journey.
Yes, I'm just gonna say on behalf of all of us here, just a massive thank you to you, Lord Peter Hain, for doing this talk, and a thank you for answering our questions. Also, thank you to Dulwich College and the Southwark Schools Learning Partnership for help setting up this talk. And also a thank you to the audience, obviously, for attending this webinar, and also for asking all the questions. And then just to point out again that obviously Peter Hain has 2 books available, which he was just talking about, the Rhino Conspiracy and Pitch Battles, and both are available from the Dulwich Books website. And also next week there's another talk from the students of Kingsdale, who will be discussing climate change with 2 guest speakers, and I think that will also be very interesting. So hopefully some of you can turn up to that.